Thanks, Jacob and Flor, for this first presentation. I am Julien Balthazar, and I will propose some insight from a territorial perspective about the ways environment is included in mobility decision making. So to start with, I'd like to present an overview of the French mobility. So for this, I have here a graph with the average distance traveled per capita and per year in France. And we see that car and planes represent most of the kilometers traveled by people, about 65% and 20% of the kilometers. So it's quite a lot. Another problem is that mobility is significantly increasing since a few decades. In particular, between 2008 and 2018, we had a 12% mobility increase if we talk about distance traveled per capita, as before. And this increase of the mobility is mainly caused by the increase of long distance mobility. The issue with this is that passenger mobility is therefore a major source of pollutant emissions. Here we have the contribution of the sector, the transport sector in the territorial French emissions. And we see that the mobility of the passenger car mobility is about the eighth of the CO2 emissions, whereas it's about a sixth of the nitrogen oxide emissions. There are also other issues about environment and the transport sector. For example, the question of the energy supply. In the European Union in 2018 imported 96% of its crude oil, so it's quite an issue. And then also passenger vehicles are a significant source of noise and land use. So the question we will deal with is the following: how can we reduce these environmental impacts? Of course, there are different solutions that can be complementary. We have, for example, modal shifting. For example, replacing trips done by plane by train, for example. There are also sobriety in usages, so doing less trips or traveling slower, for example. There is, of course, increasing the transport efficiency. It can be vehicle optimization or service optimization, or the increase of the occupancy in public transport. And then we have the fact that we can change the energy sources of the transport sector. For example, the electrification of vehicles. So the idea is that the planning of these four strategies can be done by the mobility organizing authorities. That is, for example, the case of Paris-Saclay Public Institution, which is one of our partners. And the idea of the presentation is to understand how the environmental stakes are integrated into mobility decision making, and to determine if there are ways to try to improve this considerations. So to answer this question, I performed the following method. I did an analysis of the French laws, a study of planning documents of mobility, a study of environmental assessment documents and experts reports. And I am also conducting right now some interviews of organizing authorities. So I'd like to start with the presentation of the organization of the territorial mobility. So this graph will try to give a picture of this. So first we have mobility service providers with users and companies that constitute a mobility system, which is composed of products and services. And then we have local actors like the Paris-Saclay institution that guide the providers and also define projects that will influence the mobility system. These local actors are either in France, the regions that are displayed here, or either the organizing authorities. The competencies of each local actor are quite different. The regions deal with mainly the transport services that have regional interests. They also define the regional transport infrastructure planning and the multimodality planning at the regional scale. And it also coordinates all the organizing authorities that are at a smaller scale. Here on this map, we have the local organizing authorities, so it's a way smaller scale than the regions. And the objective is to organize the local transport services, the local mobility plans, strategy, and then also the infrastructure at a smaller scale. So yeah, okay. Let's continue with the graph. So the regions and the organizing authorities define the strategy for the territory. For this strategy, they mostly define some strategic plan. For example, for the region, we have the plan of transport infrastructure, and for the organizing authorities, we have mobility plans. Mobility plans can in fact be different documents. It's quite complex. They are really strategic documents that are really long, and the process to do them are really long and complex. It's an easy procedure. And so depending on the size of the territory, we have different ways to do this kind of documents. So it's quite a complex planning strategy. So then I'll continue with, globally, we have the public authorities that can also do some mobility diagnosis to understand how the users use the mobility systems. Also, the public authorities define the national transport policy that will influence the whole mobility system that is here in the red square. And this is really important. There are also all the plans that are not linked directly to mobility, which influence mobility strategies. This graph tries to give an insight of this complexity of these interactions between different things for a territory. Here we have in the three columns the land use planning, the mobility planning, and the environmental planning, and the rows depict the different scale of decision, national scales to the more communal scale. All the arrows in this graph show the links, the interactions between different plans, and it shows the complexity of mobility because it has to consider the interaction with the land use planning and the environmental questions. Mobility plans, for example, are linked to a territorial coherence program, but also to territorial climate, air, and energy plan. Okay. So then now I have finished the construction of this figure. And the idea now is to understand how environment is integrated to the decision making of these different three level of decision. So, in fact, there are different methods that are designed to the assessment of the strategies, the projects, and the mobility systems. We have at the most strategic level, the strategic environmental assessment. We have for the projects, the environmental impact assessment. And then there are also socio-economic evaluations and the assessment of particular products and services methods. So the idea is not here to give a clear definitions of each of the methods, but I will try to give the most important findings I had where I studied the environmental methods compared to the strategy, the projects, and the mobility system. So first, we have first issue is that the context is way more dynamic than compared to the mobility strategy plan. Currently, there are fast changes in mobility practices. Notably, currently we had some true changes considering the COVID crisis or the energy crisis. And in the other hand, we have regular, frequent governance changes in different regions. There can be new competence assignments considering the national laws. There can be fusions of some intercommunalities that change the way mobility is planned. And there can be also new elections that will change the vision for mobility. So the problem is that mobility plans, on the other hand, are designed to last for about 5 to 10 years. So it does not really take into account the fact that there is some dynamic changes. They are in fact rapidly outdated, and they do not adapt to the new issue that would appear considering the crisis or the governance changes. The other issue is that considering the governance changes, is that there can be really fast some divergence in interests, no consensus. This way, mobility plans are not really applied. There are no, they can have no real impact on the mobility because the people that design them will not be the one that will apply them in the territorial data. The third point is that new laws gave authorities more stakes to deal with recently, but there are some difficulties to integrate them into their decision-making process. And there is also some issues because they find that there is a paradox between, in one hand, the environmental objectives. For example, the fact that we should not artificialize the soils, or the fact that we should reach carbon neutrality. And in the other hand, we have some development objectives considering demographic growth or economic growth. So it's hard to find an equilibrium between these two objectives. The fourth point is that mobility plans have, in fact, limited impact. Although it's useful for consultation and to summarize the current local initiatives, actions and projects that are made by the organizing authorities, there is a problem because the documents and the measures it should take are really constraining. For example, there is no budget clearly defined, there is no quantitative objectives, there is no sanctions, for example, when the emission zone are not respected. So yeah, there is a lack of efficiency of the plan. The fifth finding is the fact that even if we said that the long distance mobility was about 46 of the kilometers traveled by French inhabitants, there is a problem because, in fact, this long distance mobility is not considered in the mobility plan or regional plan. So it's quite an issue because there is no strategy to deal with the impact of the 46% of the kilometers. So considering these findings, I try to propose to some governance changes or methodological changes to deal with these different stakes. To start with, I will go with the governance proposals. So for example, currently the scope of the different plans are not clearly defined. They can have the same objectives, and so they are not really efficient. So in one hand, we should give environmental plans a more strategic and prescriptive role, where sectoral short and long-term objectives should be clearly defined. So it's not the case every time nowadays, but it should be more frequent. For example, in the case of the bicycle urban agglomeration, we have in the environmental plan a clear vision of how the population, the distance traveled by inhabitants, the consumption and the emissions should evaluate through the years from 2015 to 2050. So if we give the environmental plan a more strategic role, in the other hand, we should give the mobility plan a more tactical view. I suggest that there should be a clear description of the actions that are taken, and most importantly, it's not the case actually currently, is that there should be an estimation of the effect of the actions considering the environmental objectives of the environmental plan, And there should be also a clear timeline and a protocol to the corrective actions if the objectives are not met. Considering long distance mobility, I think there should be a rework of regional infrastructure planning because they do not really are not used to define clear long distance mobility strategy. So it should be used to do some diagnosis, some planning, and some monitoring of long distance mobility. So on the other hand, we talked about governance changes. There are also some methodological changes that should be done. The first one is that currently an environmental assessment must be performed for each plan which is presented in the following diagram. So it is the same draft than before. We have the three columns and different plans. So it makes for territories 9 plans that have to be assessed by an environmental method. So it's quite an heavy procedure. It's an heavy process. It's really time consuming and resource consuming. So I suggest that we should go towards a unique process for environmental assessment at the scale of a region and at the scale of the organizing authorities, and that's all. So it should be a simpler way to conduct these assessments, and it should be more efficient. On the other way, diagnosis, objectives, policies only considered most of the time only tank to wheels impacts. So it's about the exhaust emissions of the vehicles, and it's quite an issue because here we have a complete life cycle of a vehicle. Nowadays, the policy only considered the emissions and the impacts linked to the energy conversion of the vehicle, but it does not consider, not always, but sometimes, the impacts caused by energy supply, and it does not also consider the life cycle impacts of the equipment. So the vehicle impacts linked to its material supply, its manufacturing, its end of life are not considered. So the evaluation scope of the policies should be extended to include the whole life cycle of vehicles. The last proposals for the methodology considering environmental assessments are the following, and it's perhaps probably the objective of my thesis is to create a tool for territorial mobility linked with life cycle assessment to estimate the environmental consequences of different planning and project options. And another idea is to propose a method for territorial for organizing authorities to arbitrate between different stakes that can be at short or longer term effects. Okay. So to end this presentation, I will do some summary of what I have presented. The environmental impacts of the transport sector are quite significant, in particular considering the greenhouse gas emission or the nitrogen oxide emissions, but also land use or material consumptions. We didn't really talk about it, but it's also really material consuming. There are different levels to make mobility more sustainable, but there are actually currently some barriers on some governance issues that make it not really fully effective to deal with this. So in this presentation, I proposed some idea to tackle the different issues I presented, and it suggested notably to better consider long-distance mobility planning, to redefine the aim of the numerous planning documents. There are more than 15 planning documents, so it's quite a lot, and to design a common environmental assessment method for plan and projects. So I thank you for your attention, and I will listen to questions if you have.